Hello, everyone. Today we will discuss the work of an author who has sparked numerous discussions and continues to do so, creating passionate debates. This author is Sigmund Freud, an Austrian psychoanalyst and neurologist, active at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. Freud is recognized as the pioneer of psychoanalysis, which he established at the end of the 19th century. It is important to note that psychoanalysis is not recognized as a science in the strict sense, unlike psychology, which enjoys such recognition. Freudian theories, therefore, do not claim scientific validity, but offer philosophical insight and understanding of the complexity of the human mind and its often enigmatic and elusive nature. Freud revolutionized thinking by revealing that humans do not know themselves as well as they believe. According to him, we are unaware of much of what happens in our own minds, particularly beyond our immediate consciousness. To fully grasp psychoanalysis, it is crucial to address its fundamental concept, the unconscious. Without the unconscious, psychoanalysis would lose its essence and purpose. This concept represents an epistemological revolution in our approach and understanding of the human psyche, a term derived from the Greek psyche, meaning soul. Since the 19th century, the term psyche has been translated into German as Geist, meaning mind. Psychoanalysis, therefore, is the study of the psyche, or the human mind, and is based on the idea that most of this mind remains unknown, even inaccessible. Freud named this hidden part of the mind the unconscious. But what is meant by unconscious? It is crucial to distinguish the unconscious from mere unconsciousness, which refers to a state of losing sensory contact with the environment, as when a person faints. The Freudian unconscious is also not limited to the automatisms or mechanical actions of which we have no conscious memory. For example, completing a car journey or climbing stairs without precisely remembering these actions does not pertain to the Freudian unconscious, but rather to a lack of attention or memory retention. The unconscious, according to Freud, is a much deeper and more powerful component of our psyche, distinct from mere absence of memory or behavioral automation. After clarifying what the unconscious is not, we can explore its true nature. According to Freud, the unconscious is a deep region of the mind or psyche that is not immediately accessible to consciousness and significantly influences our behavior, thoughts, and desires. It is estimated that 90% of our mental activity is influenced by the unconscious. Freud formulated this idea by saying that the ego is not master in its own house, highlighting that consciousness is not the sole pilot of our psyche. Our mental life is predominantly regulated by the unconscious, illustrated by the iceberg metaphor, where consciousness represents only the tiny visible part, while the unconscious constitutes the submerged and dominant mass. This image helps to understand the continuity between the unconscious and consciousness, where the latter is deeply influenced by the former. Freud posits that recognizing and accepting that our mental life is dominated by the unconscious is the first step towards a form of liberation. This resonates with Spinoza's thought, which stated that recognizing our determinism is the beginning of our emancipation. By becoming aware of the influence of the unconscious, one can better understand mental processes and begin to uncover the underlying reasons for many psychic phenomena. Before continuing, it is pertinent to ask if the notion of the unconscious existed before Freud. Indeed, in antiquity, Plato developed a theory of the soul, a sort of mapping of what we call today the mind, indicating that the idea of different layers of the psyche is not entirely new. In antiquity, Plato already evoked a concept similar to what we call the unconscious today. He posited that each individual inherently possesses knowledge, but it remains non-conscious, not explicitly accessible. For Plato, humans hold an unmanifested knowledge, and the philosopher's mission is to bring this knowledge to the conscious level, a process known as the theory of reminiscence. This theory maintains that knowledge is buried within us and can be brought to consciousness through an effort of reflection and critical analysis of ideas. The philosopher's task, illustrated by Socrates' Meiutics, is to deliver the mind of individuals from this hidden knowledge, akin to how a woman gives birth to a pre-existing but not yet visible child. In this perspective, the unconscious must be revealed and expressed through a philosophical process of investigation. However, This Platonic conception differs greatly from the Freudian unconscious, which is seen as a dominant psychic entity influencing our psyche. Freud adds the dimension of a dynamic force that manifests in our symptoms, a perspective absent in Plato. Until the 16th century, the notion of the unconscious was largely ignored, without any concept similar to Freud's unconscious. In the 17th century, with Descartes, psychic life was still entirely associated with consciousness and thought, marking a stark contrast with the complexity of the unconscious as later conceptualized by Freud. Conscious thought is that which is perceivable by consciousness, while in Freud's theory, the unconscious remains hidden from it. Descartes postulated that the essence of being human lies in the capacity to think, stating that our senses can be deceptive, but absolute certainty resides in the act of thinking. One can doubt what one sees, hears, or feels, but not the fact of thinking. Even an illusory thought constitutes a form of thinking. The dream, though not real, proves that dreaming is a reality. Descartes believed that nothing exists outside of consciousness, placing thought and consciousness at the heart of human identity. Leibniz, following Descartes, also explored concepts close to the unconscious, particularly through his theory of petits perceptions, or confused perceptions, advancing toward a recognition of unconscious phenomena. A concrete example to illustrate this idea is the phenomenon of subliminal images, images briefly inserted into a film or video, which are not consciously perceived, but can influence perception or behavior. The philosopher's task, illustrated by Socrates' Meieutic, is to deliver the mind of individuals from this hidden knowledge, akin to how a woman gives birth to a pre-existing but not yet visible child. In this perspective, the unconscious must be revealed and expressed through a philosophical process of investigation. However, this Platonic conception differs greatly from the Freudian unconscious, which is seen as a dominant psychic entity influencing our psyche. Freud adds the dimension of a dynamic force that manifests in our symptoms, a perspective absent in Plato. Until the 16th century, the notion of the unconscious was largely ignored, without any concept similar to Freud's unconscious. In the 17th century, with Descartes, psychic life was still entirely associated with consciousness and thought, marking a stark contrast with the complexity of the unconscious as later conceptualized by Freud. Conscious thought is that which is perceivable by consciousness, while in Freud's theory, the unconscious remains hidden from it. Descartes postulated that the essence of being human lies in the capacity to think, stating that our senses can be deceptive, but absolute certainty resides in the act of thinking. One can doubt what one sees, hears, or feels, but not the fact of thinking. Even an illusory thought constitutes a form of thinking. The dream, though not real, proves that dreaming is a reality. Descartes believed that nothing exists outside of consciousness, placing thought and consciousness at the heart of human identity. Leibniz, following Descartes, also explored concepts close to the unconscious, particularly through his theory of petits perceptions, or confused perceptions, advancing toward a recognition of unconscious phenomena. A concrete example to illustrate this idea is the phenomenon of subliminal images, images briefly inserted into a film or video, which are not consciously perceived, but can influence perception or behavior. This analogy with hell, in a Christian religious context, emphasizes the pejorative dimension of the unconscious, a place associated with evil, sin, or behaviors disapproved by social morals. In this framework, the unconscious can be seen as the abyss of the mind, where desires and thoughts contrary to social norms reside. The mythological location of hell, often described as being under the earth, symbolizes what is inferior or despicable, contrasting with the nobility and purity associated with heaven or paradise. The unconscious, therefore, is that part of our psyche that contains repressed desires and thoughts, those very ones that oppose the rules of social life. Understanding the unconscious requires recognizing that it is the product of the constraints of civilization and social interactions, where the repression of certain impulses is inevitable. Social life demands the repression of individual impulses and desires to allow for harmonious coexistence. This principle of personal sacrifice is fundamental for maintaining social order, where each individual must limit their behavior and respect others. Laws, norms, and rules are essential to prevent purely instinctual behavior, comparable to that of animals, making social life viable. According to Rousseau, society is founded on a social contract that exchanges a portion of individual freedom for collective security. Without respect for this contract, there is a risk of reverting to the state of nature, even to widespread conflict. Freud also views humans as essentially selfish and violent, with impulses that, if uncontrolled, can lead to the destruction of civilization. The repression and sublimation of these primitive instincts are therefore necessary for peaceful cohabitation. According to Freud, humans are driven by destructive instincts, necessitating strict laws to channel these impulses and preserve social order. This duality reflects the notion of man's unsociable sociability, who, despite his selfish and animalistic inclination, can also act with altruism and consideration for others. The prohibition against expressing one's animal side creates a psychic conflict in humans that can lead to what Freud terms neurosis. Neurosis stems from the tension between opposing elements, such as desire and duty, manifesting an internal struggle between contradictory aspirations. This can be translated, for example, into the conflict between the desire for personal freedom and the constraints imposed by daily responsibilities. This internal conflict, illustrated in Greek tragedies, often pits reason against passion, reflecting the struggle between desire and moral obligations. The tragic hero, often torn between these forces, faces fatal consequences for succumbing to his passions at the expense of reason. Freud suggests that we are all, to varying degrees, affected by neurosis, resulting from the constant friction between our desires and the demands of society. The environment in which we evolve influences how we manage this tension. A strict setting can exacerbate neurosis, while a more permissive environment can mitigate it. Politeness, seen as an altruistic effort, serves to facilitate social coexistence, highlighting the pressure exerted on our desires and instincts to maintain harmony. Unlike animals, which act without moral restraint, human beings are subject to social norms, conventions, and rules, designated here as the law with a capital L, which modulate their behavior and interactions. The law and social norms instilled from education integrate so deeply within us that we end up applying them to ourselves, thus becoming our own regulators. Freud identifies this internal authority as the superego, the entity responsible for adherence to laws and norms. This internal policeman guides us, restraining us from blindly yielding to our impulses. The superego acts as a moral conscience, an angel on the shoulder, dictating what is permitted or forbidden, right or wrong. It can be likened to a judge, symbolizing the authority of the law and rendering indisputable judgments. Thus, the superego provides a framework for personal discipline, beneficial for self-management, but also a source of guilt for actions deemed reprehensible. The superego represents the vigilant eye of conscience, the internal observer who internalizes social norms. This aspect of the psyche evolves, developing more in adults than in children, as it is the result of a dynamic process of internalizing societal rules. This internalization process transforms external laws into integrated elements of our identity, so they are no longer perceived as external or imposed. Thus, the idea that we are constrained only by external forces is simplistic. In reality, we impose these rules on ourselves, limiting our actions based on our own judgment of what is appropriate or risky. Freud understood that it would be reductive to consider social and civilizational pressure as stemming only from legal authority. From childhood, we internalize society's laws, sometimes even reinforcing these constraints, becoming our own police, judges, and monitors. This self-censorship is at the heart of neurosis, resulting from the difficulty in reconciling our impulses with societal demands. This internal tension can lead some to snap, a familiar expression describing the psychic break caused by too long endured self-imposed pressure. The largely unconscious superego operates without us being fully aware of our role as personal regulators, acting in accordance with social norms, often without perceiving their weight. The unconscious, made up of desires and thoughts repressed by the superego, occupies a deep zone of our psyche, which Freud calls the Id, S in German. The Id represents the most obscure and confused part of our mind, difficult to pinpoint or define clearly, reflecting its mysterious and often incomprehensible nature. The Id resides in an area of the mind where unconscious desires churn, acting on the personality and constantly clashing with the superego. The ID is a reservoir of impulses seeking expression, even against the constraints of the superego, like a tumultuous force breaking through the barriers of propriety and prohibition. Although the unconscious is not limited solely to the ID, since the superego also contains unconscious aspects, the unconscious is primarily populated by these repressed impulsive elements. The ID is often illustrated by the image of a dark and mysterious cellar, inspiring fear, as in Stephen King's novel It, where a terrifying clown embodies the buried horrors and deep anxieties. This underground place symbolizes the unknown and elusive, reflecting the dark and confused aspect of the id. The conscious mind is influenced by this underlying force, a perpetual conflict between the id and the superego. Freud, in his second topography, describes the human psyche as a multi-level structure, with the id representing the lowest level, the superego the highest, and the ego acting as the intermediary. The ego, as a mediating entity, manages the conflict between the id's impulsive desires and the normative constraints of the superego, often resulting in neurosis due to this ongoing tension. The ego captures the conflict between the superego and the id, serving as an intermediary in this internal struggle. I will not delve into Freud's first topography here, which differentiates the conscious, preconscious, and unconscious, preferring to focus on the second topography, which offers a more accessible understanding and was revised by Freud himself. Humans are largely influenced by their unconscious, a part of their mind to which they do not have direct access. However, we can connect with the unconscious through indirect means, notably through dreams. Freud considers dreams as the arena where unconscious desires unfold, often filled with familiar scenes drawn from recent experiences. Although dreams are the window to the unconscious, it is not really us who dream, but rather our unconscious expressing itself. Freud emphasizes that we are not the masters of our own psychic house, and likewise, we do not control the contents of our dreams. Therefore, we are not responsible for these unconscious manifestations and should not feel guilt for what they reveal. Freud distinguishes between the manifest content, the events directly experienced in the dream, and the latent content, the deep and symbolic meaning hidden behind these events in dreams. The manifest content is what could be depicted if the dream were turned into a movie, whereas the latent content contains the true desires and conflicts of the unconscious. In the dream, the manifest content represents the explicitly experienced events, like dreaming of retaking one's baccalaureate surrounded by young students and supervised. This constitutes the facade of the dream experience. Beside it is the latent content, which unveils the deep and often hidden meaning of the dream, revealing what lies behind the concrete scenes. For Freud, the essence of the dream lies in this latent content, with the manifest content merely being a vehicle to express unconscious desires. The unconscious disguises itself, allowing for observation without immediate recognition. Dreaming of retaking the baccalaureate does not necessarily mean regretting one's school past, but can symbolize a deeper issue, with the baccalaureate acting as a metaphor. Therefore, the interpretation of dreams does not focus on the manifest content, but seeks to extract the latent content to uncover what these images or events represent. Beyond dreams, the unconscious also manifests through slips of the tongue, where a verbal slip can reveal unconscious thoughts or desires. A slip of the tongue is not just a verbal error, but an indicator of the unconscious, unveiling what is normally concealed. Thus, Freud considers a slip of the tongue as an involuntary expression of the unconscious, offering insight into the underlying forces that influence our behavior. Saying "good evening" at noon after a meeting might reveal, through a slip of the tongue, fatigue or boredom, unconsciously expressing the wish that the day were already over. A slip of the tongue replaces one word with another, revealing unconscious thoughts or desires. Often of a sexual nature in Freudian theory, these parapraxies reflect the predominance of sexual drives in our psyche. Freud has often been criticized for interpreting various behaviors primarily from the angle of sexuality, a perspective he embraced, considering the sexual drive as central in our unconscious behavior. Thus, a sexual slip of the tongue is seen as natural and unsurprising, given that, according to Freud, our psychic life is dominated by these drives. Another phenomenon related to the unconscious is the Freudian slip, similar to the slip of the tongue but manifesting in actions. For example, not hearing the alarm for an important job interview could be interpreted as a Freudian slip, revealing an unconscious desire to avoid the interview. Although we are conscious of our desire to obtain the position, a Freudian slip could indicate an unconscious reluctance to this opportunity. A Freudian slip, like a slip of the tongue, reveals significant failures that manifest our unconscious desires. These phenomena are valuable because they offer an outlet for the unconscious, allowing it to express itself without the superego's knowledge. If these desires remain without a means of expression, neurosis can intensify into more severe disorders, such as psychosis or hysteria, illustrating the failure to manage the conflict between the id and the superego. Freud developed the concept of sublimation, which illustrates another way for unconscious desire to manifest. In physics, sublimation describes the direct transition from a solid state to a gaseous state, a metamorphosis that requires significant energy. Analogously, desire, seen as an energetic force, motivates our thoughts and actions. Sublimation, then, is the process by which desires, often of a sexual nature, are diverted towards more socially valued or considered superior goals. This process transforms the energy of sexual desires into motivations for non-sexual activities, thus allowing a more acceptable and enriching expression of fundamental impulses. Sublimation involves channeling sexual desire towards a non-sexual goal. For example, a single man with sexual desire can choose to repress this desire, thus risking the development of neurosis, or masturbate for immediate satisfaction, which can be seen as a waste of energy with no higher purpose. A third option is to redirect this sexual energy towards a creative or productive act, representing a mediated satisfaction of desire. The act of creation serves as an intermediary, transforming the sexual drive into a socially valued achievement, as in the case of an artist or scientist. These individuals convert their libido into creative or intellectual energy, thus realizing works or discoveries that benefit from cultural or scientific recognition and value. Although these activities seem far removed from any sexual connotation, they are, according to Freud, a transformation of sexual energy, thus illustrating sublimation. Instead of dissipating or expressing sexual desire in a disordered manner, the individual redirects it towards the creation of meaningful works, reaffirming that even in sublimation, the origin of desire remains sexual. One could also mention the case of the athlete or sportsman who, during a competition, must preserve and channel his energy, including his libido, to optimize his performance. The common practice in boxing of observing a period of abstinence before a fight illustrates how sexual and aggressive energy is transformed into physical power and combativeness. The notion of libido, although associated with Freud, is not new. It has its roots in Latin and was used by St. Augustine in the 5th century. St. Augustine distinguished 3 forms of libido, or sexual energies, each with distinct objectives. The first, libido sciendi, represents sexual and sensual energy in its most raw form, oriented towards bodily pleasure. The second, libido dominandi, often translated as pride, refers to the desire for domination, as observed in warriors who redirect their sexual energy towards conquest or competition. This transformation evokes the example of the boxer using his sexual energy to win a fight. The third, libido sciendi, is related to the desire for knowledge, illustrating the process of sublimation according to Freud, where sexual drive is diverted towards the pursuit of an abstract, elevated, or noble goal. These 3 types of libido reflect the diversity of ways in which sexual energy can be expressed or sublimated in different areas of human life. The 3 concupiscences mentioned by Pascal, revisiting the thought of St. Augustine, illustrate human desires marked by original sin, signaling a path towards understanding the transformation of sexual desire into non-sexual forms. The libido sciendi, representing the curiosity that led Adam and Eve to transgression, is seen as a desire comparable to other forms of concupiscence, all stemming from the imperfect and sinful nature of humans, according to Pascal. This view aligns with that of Plato, who divided the human soul into 3 parts, including bodily desires, martial ardor, and the rational pursuit of knowledge, each translating a different orientation of desire. In this context, Freud sees sublimation as the ability to redirect sexual drive towards cultural or intellectual activities without denying the sexual origin of our motivations. He clearly distinguishes the sexual origin of desires from their expression in non-sexual acts, thus providing a way to master these impulses. This mastery represents a form of freedom, allowing us to choose how and towards what to direct our sexual energies, as in philosophy or artistic creation, thus distinguishing the pursuit of knowledge from direct sexual satisfaction. Although Freud identifies a common origin for immediate satisfaction and the search for understanding, he does not consider them as equivalent in value. Immediate satisfaction is seen as a manifestation of the desire that controls us, whereas in sublimation, we harness this desire to achieve a higher ideal. Thus, desire transforms from a dominating force into a tool for our fulfillment, allowing us to transcend mere impulse and act with intention and creativity. This dynamic indicates that, despite the pervasive influence of the unconscious and hidden desires, we possess a certain autonomy. This freedom allows us to surpass ourselves, not to be merely victims of our impulses, but creators, transformers of reality, capable of sublimating our existence and our environment. Thank you for your attention.